Lansing County, Michigan. Early December 1987. The kind of week that should have ended with nothing more dramatic than holiday shopping and weekend plans with family. Sarah and Tom Mitchell had been married for just under 2 years, still wrapped up in that early phase of building something permanent together. Their modest ranch house sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood where kids rode bikes until dusk and neighbors waved from driveways. They weren't rich by any means, but they were content. Sarah worked as a receptionist at a local dentist's office, charming patients with her easy smile and genuine warmth. Tom had steady work as an electrician, often coming home with stories about the oddball jobs he'd handled that day. They talked about kids constantly, debating names, imagining bedrooms painted in soft yellows and blues. Just 3 nights before everything changed, they'd hosted a small dinner party. Sarah's laughter had filled the kitchen as she burned the garlic bread, Tom teasing her gently while their friends raised glasses and mocked toast to her culinary disasters. The evening had been full of light, the kind of memory that gets replayed fondly years later. They'd said good night to their guests around midnight, standing on the porch together, arms wrapped around each other against the December chill. Nothing about that moment hinted at danger. Nothing suggested an ending was near. By Thursday morning, both of them were gone. Neither showed up for work. Neither answered repeated phone calls. And when Tom's co-worker and Sarah's sister arrived at the house to check on them, they discovered a scene that would become Lansing County's most haunting unsolved mystery for nearly 3 decades. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Sarah Cole came into the world on June 12, 1966, the 4th child in a household that already felt too small for the number of people living in it. 6 kids total, all crammed into a 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of Lansing. The walls were thin enough that arguments carried from room to room, and privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Money was perpetually scarce. Her father worked double shifts at the auto plant. Her mother took in sewing projects to make ends meet, and still, there were weeks when dinner meant splitting a single casserole 6 ways. But what the Cole family lacked in financial stability, they tried to compensate for with loyalty. Everyone helped. Everyone contributed. Everyone understood that survival meant sticking together, even when togetherness felt suffocating. Sarah learned early how to navigate a crowded house. She wasn't the loudest child or the most demanding, but she had presence. People noticed her not because she fought for attention, but because she radiated something steady and kind. Her teachers described her as bright and dependable. Her friends said she could make you feel like the most important person in the room just by listening. Even her siblings, who bickered constantly with one another, seemed to soften around her. She started babysitting at 12, earning pocket money that she saved meticulously in a coffee can hidden under her bed. By 16, she was working part-time at a local diner, balancing school with long weekend shifts. The work was exhausting, but she liked having her own money. She liked the independence it represented. She told her older sister more than once that she was going to build a life where she didn't have to count pennies or stress about whether the electricity would stay on. Home wasn't always easy. Her father's temper flared when the bills piled up. Her mother carried a weariness that settled into every gesture. But through it all, Sarah stayed close to her siblings, especially her older brother, Derek. He was 3 years older, broad-shouldered and protective in a way that made her feel safe even when things at home got tense. Derek had a temper of his own, one that flared when he thought someone was disrespecting his family. More than once, Sarah watched him get into fights defending one of his younger siblings. He didn't talk much about feelings, but his actions made his loyalty clear. For Sarah, childhood was a mixture of hand-me-down clothes, shared bedrooms, and the constant hum of noise that comes with a large family, but also taught her resilience. She learned how to work hard, how to make people feel valued, and how to dream about something better. Those lessons would follow her into adulthood, shaping the choices she made and the future she fought to create. As Sarah moved into her late teens, the dreams she'd carried began taking more concrete shape. She wanted stability. She wanted a home that felt like hers. She wanted someone who saw her the way she deserved to be seen. That desire made her vulnerable in ways she didn't fully recognize at the time. She met a man named Kyle during her senior year of high school. He was older by a few years, confident in the way that feels attractive when you're 18 and eager to prove you're mature enough to handle adult relationships. They started dating casually, but it escalated quickly. Within months, they were talking about moving in together. Sarah's family had mixed feelings. Her mother worried she was rushing, but Sarah was determined to start building the life she'd always imagined. The relationship seemed promising at first. Kyle had a job in construction, and they rented a small apartment on the south side of town. For a while, Sarah convinced herself it was working. She kept up with her job at the diner, contributed more than her share to rent, and tried to ignore the small cracks forming beneath the surface. Kyle wasn't consistent. Some weeks he'd be attentive and affectionate, talking about their future together. Other weeks he'd disappear for days, offering vague excuses about work or friends. The instability wore on her. Arguments became more frequent. He'd criticize the way she managed money, even though she was the one keeping them afloat most months. He'd accuse her of being too close to her family, too dependent on her siblings' opinions. The accusations didn't make sense, but they chipped away at her confidence nonetheless. Then one night, everything came to a head. Sarah told him she thought they needed to take a break, that things weren't working the way she'd hoped. Kyle didn't take it well. What started as a tense conversation escalated into shouting. When Sarah tried to leave the room, he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. She pulled away, shocked, and he shoved her into the wall. The impact rattled her, but what came next was worse. He slapped her across the face, hard enough that her vision blurred for a moment. She grabbed her keys and left immediately, driving straight to her sister's house with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face. Her sister took one look at the red mark blooming across Sarah's cheek and made her promise never to go back. Sarah agreed, but the damage was already done, not just physically but emotionally. She felt humiliated, angry at herself for not seeing the warning signs sooner. Word got back to Derek within hours. Her older brother, the one who'd always been her protector, didn't hesitate. He drove to the apartment where Sarah had been living, found Kyle there, and confronted him directly. The confrontation turned physical. Derek didn't apologize for it later. He made it clear to Kyle that if he ever came near Sarah again, the consequences would be far worse. For Sarah, the breakup was painful but necessary. It taught her what she didn't want. It reminded her that she deserved better, and it made her more cautious about who she let into her life. She moved back home temporarily, saved money from her job, and slowly started rebuilding her sense of self. She wasn't going to settle again. Not for anyone. A few months after leaving Kyle behind, Sarah found herself back in her familiar rhythm at the diner. It was there, during a busy Saturday lunch rush in early 1985, that she met Tom Mitchell. He'd come in with a few co-workers, still wearing his work boots and a faded company shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. He ordered coffee and a sandwich. Nothing fancy, but something about the way he smiled when she refilled his cup caught her attention. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to impress her with smooth talk or exaggerated stories. He was just steady, calm, the kind of person who seemed comfortable in his own skin. Before he left, he asked if she'd like to get dinner sometime. She hesitated, still carrying the bruises from her last relationship. Not the physical ones, but the emotional ones that took longer to heal. But something about Tom felt different. Safe. So she said yes. Their first date was simple. Dinner at a family-owned Italian place. Nothing expensive, just good food and easy conversation. Tom talked about his work as an electrician, the odd jobs he took on, the satisfaction of fixing something that had been broken. Sarah told him about her family, about working since she was 16, about wanting to build a life that felt secure. They stayed at that restaurant for hours, long after their plates had been cleared, just talking. What started as one date became two, then five, then too many to count. They fell into a rhythm that felt natural. Tom would pick her up after her shifts at the diner, and they'd drive around town with the radio playing, talking about everything and nothing. He met her family early on, shaking Derek's hand firmly and earning a subtle nod of approval that Sarah recognized immediately. Her mother liked him too. She said he had kind eyes. Tom was patient with her in ways Kyle never had been. He didn't rush her or pressure her. He didn't make her feel like she had to prove anything. He just showed up consistently, reliably, making her feel valued in the quiet, everyday ways that mattered most. He'd bring her coffee before work, leave little notes in her car, listen when she vented about difficult customers. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was just real. They dated for a little over a year before Tom proposed. It wasn't an elaborate setup, no fancy restaurant or orchestrated surprise. They were sitting on the porch of her family's house one evening, watching the sun set, when he turned to her and said he didn't want to imagine his life without her in it. He pulled out a simple ring, nothing extravagant, and asked her to marry him. Sarah didn't need time to think about it. She said yes immediately, tears streaming down her face, feeling like everything she'd worked toward was finally falling into place. They planned a small wedding for the spring of 1986. Just close family and a handful of friends. The ceremony took place in a modest church on the north side of town, the same one Sarah's parents had been married in decades earlier. She wore a simple white dress, nothing elaborate, and carried a bouquet of daisies. Tom stood at the altar looking nervous and happy in equal measure. When they exchanged vows, Sarah felt a certainty she'd never experienced before. This was right. This was the life she'd been working toward. The reception was held at a local community hall. There was dancing, laughter, and a cake that Sarah's mother had baked herself. Friends clinked glasses and offered toasts. Derek gave a short speech, his voice uncharacteristically soft, talking about how Sarah had always been the glue that held their family together and how Tom was lucky to have her. Sarah cried happy tears, and Tom squeezed her hand under the table, grinning. After the reception, they drove off for a weekend honeymoon at a small cabin near the lake. It wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs. They spent 2 days away from the noise of everyday life, just the two of them, talking about the future they'd build together. When they returned, they moved into the modest ranch house Tom had been renting for the past year. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with worn carpet, but it was theirs. They spent weekends painting walls, hanging curtains, arranging furniture piece by piece. Sarah would stand in the doorway of the second bedroom, arms crossed, imagining it filled with a crib and toys. Tom would catch her staring and wrap his arms around her from behind, whispering that it wouldn't be long before that room was full of life. By December of 1987, they'd been married for a year and a half. The house was starting to feel like home. They'd settled into a comfortable routine, work during the week, quiet evenings together, long talks about starting a family. They weren't wealthy, but they were happy, genuinely, deeply happy, and everyone who knew them could see it. On the evening of December 8th, 1987, Sarah and Tom were invited to a co-workers' holiday party. It was the kind of casual gathering they both enjoyed, good food, familiar faces, and an excuse to relax after a long week. They arrived around 7, Sarah wearing a festive red sweater, Tom in his usual jeans and a button-down shirt. They mingled easily, laughing with friends, sipping drinks, enjoying the warmth of the crowded room. As the night wore on, Sarah grew more animated, her laughter ringing out across the room as she joked with a group of coworkers. Tom stayed close, his hand resting on the small of her back, smiling at her in that patient, affectionate way he always did. They danced to a few songs, swaying together even when the music didn't quite call for it. Friends would later describe them as inseparable that night, completely wrapped up in each other. Around 11, They decided it was time to head home. They said their goodbyes, bundled up against the cold December air, and walked to their car. A few people watched them leave, waving as they pulled out of the driveway. It was an unremarkable departure. Just two people heading home after a good night, ready to settle in a bed and start another week. No one had any reason to worry. No one imagined it would be the last time anyone saw them alive. They drove back to their house on Maple Street, unaware that danger was waiting. The home they'd worked so hard to make their own, the place where they'd planned to raise a family, would become the site of unimaginable violence. That short drive home, filled with the quiet contentment of a good evening, marked the end of everything they'd built together. 2 days passed before anyone realized something was wrong. Thursday morning arrived, and Tom didn't show up at the electrical company where he'd worked for the past 3 years. He was never late. He never missed a shift without calling. His boss tried reaching him multiple times, each call going straight to an answering machine that remained full and unanswered. By midday, concern had turned to alarm. At the same time, Sarah's absence from the dentist's office was equally troubling. She'd been scheduled to open that morning, and when she didn't arrive, the office manager called repeatedly. No answer. Sarah was reliable to a fault. Missing work without notice wasn't something she did. Sarah's sister, Lisa, got a call from the office manager around noon. The worry in the woman's voice was unmistakable. Lisa immediately tried calling Sarah herself, then Tom. Nothing. A knot of dread formed in her stomach. She called Derek, and within minutes, he was in his truck heading toward their house. Lisa followed in her own car, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, trying to convince herself there was a simple explanation. When they pulled up to the house on Maple Street, everything looked normal from the outside. The curtains were drawn. Tom's truck sat in the driveway. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing that suggested trouble. Derek knocked loudly on the front door, calling out their names. Silence. He tried the handle. Locked. He walked around to the back, peering through windows, his unease growing with every step. Lisa stood on the front lawn, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her breath coming in short, anxious bursts. Derek returned to the front, his face grim. He made the decision quickly. He kicked in the front door, the wood splintering around the lock. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Derek moved through the living room, calling out, his voice echoing through the empty house. Lisa stayed close behind him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. They moved down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The first bedroom door was open. Derek stepped inside, and what he saw stopped him cold. Sarah was lying on the bed, partially covered by blankets, her face turned toward the wall. For a brief, desperate moment, he thought she might just be sleeping. But then he saw the blood, the stillness that wasn't sleep. He backed out of the room immediately, his face ashen, and grabbed Lisa by the arm before she could see. He pulled her toward the front door, his voice shaking as he told her to wait outside. Lisa didn't argue. She stumbled onto the front lawn, her legs barely holding her up. Derek pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. His voice was unsteady as he told the dispatcher what he'd found, where they were, that they needed police and an ambulance immediately. While they waited, Derek forced himself to check the rest of the house. His mind was screaming at him to stop, to get out, but he had to know if Tom was inside too. He found him in the garage. Tom was slumped over the steering wheel of his truck, the driver's side window shattered. Blood stained the seat and dashboard. Derek backed out slowly, ball rising in his throat. Within minutes, sirens filled the quiet neighborhood. Police cars and ambulances arrived, officers immediately securing the scene. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, drawn by the commotion, whispering to one another as yellow tape went up around the property. Derek and Lisa were moved away from the house, both of them in shock, trying to process what they just walked into. Inside, investigators moved carefully through the home. They documented everything: the position of the bodies, the lack of forced entry, the undisturbed rooms. What they found was chilling in its precision. Sarah had been shot multiple times while lying in bed. Tom had been shot in his truck, likely as he sat behind the wheel. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of a robbery. Cash and valuables remained untouched throughout the house. Whoever had done this hadn't come for money. This was something else entirely. No weapon was found at the scene. No shell casings were recovered. The killer had taken a gun with them and had been careful enough to collect evidence as they went. It was methodical, calculated, and deeply personal. By the time investigators stepped back outside into the cold December afternoon, they knew they were dealing with something far more complex than a random act of violence. Detectives arrived within the hour, immediately recognizing the gravity of what they were dealing with. The scene spoke to careful planning, not chaotic impulse. They started with the most obvious question in any double homicide. Could this have been a murder-suicide? That theory collapsed almost immediately. No firearm was present anywhere on the property. Whoever had killed Sarah and Tom had taken the weapon with them when they left. Officers moved through the house methodically, documenting every detail. The front and back doors showed no signs of forced entry. Windows were intact. Nothing had been broken or pried open. Drawers remained closed. Furniture sat undisturbed, and personal belongings were exactly where they should be. A wallet sat on the kitchen counter with cash still inside. Sarah's purse hung on a hook by the door, untouched. In the bedroom, jewelry lay in plain view on the dresser. This wasn't a robbery, not even close. Investigators turned their attention to Tom's truck. The driver's side window had been shattered by a bullet, and Tom was slumped forward, his body positioned in a way that suggested he'd been shot while sitting behind the wheel. The keys were still in the ignition, though the engine was off. A small detail caught their attention. Tom had clearly been preparing to go somewhere, or had just returned. The positioning suggested he'd been caught off guard, possibly by someone approaching the vehicle. Inside the bedroom, the scene was equally chilling. Sarah had been shot multiple times while lying in bed. The blankets were pulled up around her, and her position suggested she'd been asleep when the attack occurred. 3 bullet wounds, all fatal, all delivered at close range. There was no sign she'd struggled or tried to flee. It had been swift and brutal. The most telling detail came when investigators searched for evidence of the shots themselves. No shell casings were found. Not in the bedroom, not near the truck, not anywhere in the house or yard. The shooter had taken the time to collect each one before leaving. That level of control, that degree of planning, pointed toward someone who knew what they were doing, someone who had thought this through. Detectives also noted the timing. Sarah and Tom had been seen alive on Tuesday night, leaving a party. Their bodies were discovered on Thursday morning. Somewhere in that roughly 36-hour window, someone had entered their home, killed them both, and left without leaving behind obvious evidence. The lack of forced entry suggested Sarah and Tom may have known their killer, or at the very least, they hadn't perceived them as a threat. As the sun set on that first day, investigators stood in the driveway, reviewing what they knew. 2 young people, well-liked, no known enemies, killed in their own home with precision and purpose. No weapon, no casings, no clear motive. The house held almost no answers, which meant the answers had to be found somewhere else. In their relationships, in their history, in the people who knew them best. The investigation shifted quickly to the people closest to Sarah and Tom. Detectives understood that in cases like this, where there was no sign of forced entry and no evidence of robbery, the killer was almost always someone the victims knew. They started with recent conflicts, old relationships, anyone who might have held a grudge. One of the first names to surface was Kyle, Sarah's ex-boyfriend. Detectives knew about the violent end to their relationship, the bruises he'd left on her, the confrontation with Derek that followed. It was impossible to ignore someone with a history of violence toward the victim. They brought him in for questioning within days. Kyle denied any involvement. He was defensive, visibly nervous, but he answered every question. He provided details about where he'd been the night Sarah and Tom were killed. He'd been working a night shift at a construction site across town, and multiple co-workers confirmed his presence. Security logs from the site backed up his story. His timeline was airtight, verified by people with no reason to lie for him. Detectives pushed, looking for cracks, but there weren't any. Cole wasn't their guy. Then, a week into the investigation, something unexpected happened. A man walked into the Lansing County Sheriff's office and asked to speak to the detectives handling the Mitchell case. He introduced himself as the previous owner of the house on Maple Street. His street name was Blade, though his legal name was Marcus Kane. He had a reputation, someone who'd run with rough crowds, dealt drugs in the past, and made enemies along the way. Blade explained that he'd sold the house to Sarah and Tom earlier that year, but he was worried the murders might have been meant for him. He talked about old debts, people from his past who might have wanted him dead. He mentioned threats he'd received, violence that had followed him for years. He even admitted he'd been shot once before, a result of a deal gone bad. He was convinced someone had shown up at the house looking for him and found the wrong people. Detectives took him seriously. They followed every lead he gave them, tracking down associates, digging into his history, trying to find a connection between his old life and the violence that had taken place at the house. But the more they dug, the less sense it made. No one from Blade's past had a reason to target Sarah and Tom. No one even knew who they were. Eventually, Blade himself acknowledged that his theory didn't hold up. The murders weren't connected to him. It was just an unfortunate coincidence that he'd once lived there. Just as the investigation seemed to be stalling, another tragedy struck the area. On Christmas Eve, less than 3 weeks after Sarah and Tom were killed, a woman named Jennifer Harris was found stabbed to death in a field behind her home. She lived less than 2 miles from the Mitchell house. She was roughly the same age as Sarah, and the proximity and timing immediately raised red flags. Investigators wondered if they were dealing with a serial offender, someone targeting young people in the area. The community was terrified. Parents kept their kids inside. Neighbors installed new locks. Local news outlets ran stories warning residents to be cautious. Detectives worked around the clock, trying to find a connection between Jennifer's murder and the Mitchells. But once again, the evidence refused to cooperate. Jennifer's life didn't intersect with Sarah's or Tom's. They hadn't known each other. They didn't share friends, workplaces, or social circles. The method of killing was different. The circumstances were different. As much as investigators wanted to find a link, there simply wasn't one. Jennifer's case eventually led in another direction entirely, and a connection to the Mitchells was ruled out. Then someone remembered an older case. In 1978, nearly a decade earlier, a young woman named Karen Brennan had been stabbed to death less than 3 miles from where Sarah and Tom lived. The similarities were eerie. Young victim, violent death, quiet neighborhood. On paper, it looked like a pattern. 3 brutal killings in the same general area over the course of a decade. Detectives pulled the old file and started comparing details. They looked for overlaps in suspects, methods, evidence. But once again, there was nothing. Karen's case had its own suspects, its own timeline, its own unresolved questions. It didn't connect to the Mitchells or to Jennifer Harris. The proximity was just a coincidence, as unsettling as that was to accept. By the end of 1988, investigators had exhausted their most promising leads. They'd interviewed dozens of people, followed every theory they could find, and come up empty every time. The case began to slow down. Calls stopped coming in. New crimes demanded attention. And slowly, inevitably, the investigation into the deaths of Sarah and Tom Mitchell went cold. The file was placed in a cabinet, thick with notes and photographs and unanswered questions. Detectives moved on to other cases. The community's fear faded into uneasy memory, and Sarah and Tom's families were left with nothing but grief and silence. After the investigation went cold, life moved forward for everyone except the people who had loved Sarah and Tom most. Their families were left to navigate a grief that had no resolution No closure, no explanation. Holidays became unbearable. Birthdays passed unmarked. Every December brought the same crushing reminder of what had been taken from them. Lisa, Sarah's sister, carried the weight of that day in ways that never lessened. She couldn't stop replaying the moment Derek had pulled her back from the bedroom, the look on his face, the way her legs had nearly given out on the front lawn. She'd lie awake at night, haunted by the stillness of the house, the horrible wrongness of it all. She visited Sarah's grave regularly, sitting on the cold ground, talking to her sister as if she might still hear. Derek struggled too, but in a different way. He'd always been Sarah's protector, the older brother who stepped in when things got dangerous. But this time, he hadn't been able to protect her. That failure ate at him. He replayed the timeline obsessively. If he called her that night, if he'd stopped by the house earlier, if he'd sensed something was wrong. He knew none of it was logical, but guilt doesn't follow logic. Tom's family faced their own version of the same pain. His mother stopped decorating for Christmas. The holiday had once been her favorite, but now it only reminded her of the call she'd received from the police, the drive to the station, the moment she'd been told her son was gone. Tom's father grew quieter, more withdrawn. He'd sit in his garage for hours, not working on anything, just staring into space. The Mitchells and the Coles stayed in touch, bound together by shared loss. They'd gather occasionally, awkward and heavy with unspoken emotion, trying to comfort one another even though no comfort existed. They asked the same questions every time. Why? Who? How could this happen? And every time, the answers remained out of reach. Meanwhile, the case file sat untouched in a storage room at the Lansing County Sheriff's Office. Detectives retired. New officers joined the department. The file was mentioned occasionally during training sessions or internal reviews, always as an example of a case that had slipped through their fingers. But no one had the time or resources to revisit it. There were too many active investigations, too many immediate concerns. As the years passed, the story of Sarah and Tom became a local tragedy people whispered about but rarely discussed openly. Older residents remembered the shock of it, the fear that had gripped the neighborhood. Younger people heard the story secondhand, another piece of dark history that belonged to a time before they'd arrived. Technology advanced. DNA testing became more sophisticated. Cold case units started forming in departments across the country. But in Lansing County, the Mitchell file remained where it had always been, filed away, gathering dust, waiting for someone to care enough to open it again. For more than 20 years, the truth stayed buried, and the families learned to live with a wound that never quite healed, an absence that could never be filled, and questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. In 2010, Lansing County announced the formation of a dedicated cold case unit. 2 detectives were assigned to the division, Michael Torres and Rachel Brennan. They were brought in specifically because they had no history with the area, no old friendships, no connections to any of the families involved in unsolved cases. They were outsiders, and that was exactly what the department needed. Their mandate was simple: go through the coldest cases on the books, the ones that have been sitting untouched for decades, and see if fresh eyes could find what earlier investigators had missed. They were given access to every file, every piece of evidence, and every resource the department could provide. The Mitchell case was one of the first they pulled. When Torres opened the folder, he was struck by how thick it was. Hundreds of pages, photographs of the scene, witness statements, timelines, maps. Everything the original detectives had gathered was meticulously documented. But as he read through it, he also noticed something else: assumptions that had never been challenged, alibis that had been accepted without enough scrutiny, threads that had been dropped too early. Brennan sat across from him, flipping through the crime scene photos. She paused on one image, the bedroom where Sarah had been killed. Then another. Tom slumped in his truck. She looked up at Torres. This wasn't random. He nodded. Someone they knew. They spread the entire file across a conference table, creating a visual timeline of everything that had happened. They noted every interview, every suspect, every lead that had been followed and abandoned. And then they started looking for gaps. Questions that should have been asked but weren't. People who should have been pressed harder but were let go too easily. One name kept appearing in the file, not as a suspect, but as a witness. Derek Cole, Sarah's older brother, the one who'd found the bodies, the one who'd kicked in the door. His statements were in the file, clear and consistent. But Torres and Brennan noticed something about them. They were almost too consistent. The kind of consistency that comes from repetition, not from genuine recollection. They also noticed that Derek had been interviewed once in 1987 and then never again. His alibi had been provided by his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Monica. She'd backed up his story completely. Detectives had noted it in the file and moved on. But Torres and Brennan weren't ready to move on so quickly. They started digging into Derek's background, his history, his relationships, and slowly, piece by piece, a more complicated picture began to emerge. This wasn't a case that had gone cold because there were no answers. It had gone cold because the right questions had never been asked. Torres and Brennan decided to track down Monica. It had been more than 20 years since she'd given her statement, and they knew people changed over time. Relationships ended. Loyalties shifted. Fear faded. They found her living 2 counties over, working as a nurse, divorced, living alone. When they called and asked if she'd be willing to sit down for a new interview, she hesitated. But after a long pause, she agreed. They met her at a quiet diner on a weekday afternoon. Monica looked older, tired in a way that went beyond age. She ordered coffee and wrapped her hands around the mug like she needed the warmth. Torres and Brennan didn't push right away. They started with small talk, easing into the conversation, making her feel comfortable. Then, gently, they brought up the events of December 1987. Monica's face changed the moment they mentioned Derek's name. Something flickered in her eyes. Not anger exactly. Fear, maybe, or relief. Like she'd been carrying something heavy for too long and finally had permission to set it down. Brennan leaned forward slightly. We just want to make sure we have the story right. Can you walk us through where Derek was that night? Monica stared into her coffee. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, quietly, she spoke. Elite. The words hung in the air. Torres kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. What do you mean? She looked up at them, eyes wet. The alibi I gave back then. It wasn't true. Derek told me what to say. He made me practice it with him until I had it memorized. I was so young. I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified of him. Brennan kept her voice calm, steady. What really happened that night? Monica took a shaky breath. He left. Late. Around midnight. Said he had to take care of something. Told me not to ask questions. I didn't see him again until the next afternoon. Torres wrote quickly in his notebook. Did he say where he was going? She shook her head. No, but when he came back, he was different. Quiet. Kept washing his hands over and over, even though they looked clean. He wouldn't look at me. Brennan asked the next question carefully. Did he ever tell you what he'd done? Monica's hands trembled around the coffee mug. Not directly, but a few days later, after Sarah's body was found, he sat me down and told me exactly what I needed to say if the police asked. He said if I didn't stick to the story, something bad would happen to me too. I believed him. I was 19 years old. I didn't know what to do. She paused, then added, I've carried this for 23 years. I try to forget about it, tried to convince myself it didn't matter. But it does, doesn't it? Torres nodded. It matters. Before they left the diner, they asked Monica if she'd be willing to take a polygraph test just to confirm what she was telling them. She agreed without hesitation. A week later, the results came back. She was telling the truth. The alibi that had protected Derek Cole for more than 2 decades had just collapsed. With Monica's new statement in hand, Torres and Brennan knew they had to dig deeper into Derek's background. They needed to understand who he really was not just who his family thought he was. They started by reaching out to people who had known him in 1987, friends, co-workers, ex-girlfriends. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture. They tracked down another woman Derek had been involved with during that same period. Her name was Angela, and she'd dated him briefly before Monica. When Torres and Brennan showed up at her door, she seemed unsurprised, like she'd been waiting for this conversation for years. Angela invited them inside and sat across from them in her living room, arms crossed defensively. "What do you want to know?" Brennan started gently. "We're looking into Derek's relationship with his sister, Sarah. Did he ever talk about her?" Angela's expression darkened. "Yeah, he talked about her. Too much." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then sighed. "He was obsessed with her. I don't know how else to put it. He'd talk about her constantly. How close they were. How no one understood her like he did. At first, I thought it was just normal sibling stuff. But then he'd say things that didn't sit right." Torres leaned forward. "Like what?" Angela looked uncomfortable. He'd talk about her body, how she looked, things a brother shouldn't notice, let alone mention. It made my skin crawl. One time, he told me he'd been in love with her when they were teenagers. He said it casually, like it was normal. When I told him that was messed up, he got angry. Told me I didn't understand their bond. Brennan kept her tone even. "Did he ever mention anything physical between them?" Angela nodded slowly. "He implied it. Never said it outright, but the way he talked. Yeah, I think something happened between them when they were younger. I broke up with him not long after that conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was dangerous." After leaving Angela's house, the detectives continued reaching out to other family members. They want to know if anyone else had noticed anything unusual about Derek's behavior, especially after Sarah's death. What they found was a series of small, troubling details that, when combined, formed a deeply unsettling pattern. One of Sarah's cousins recalled Derek talking about the crime scene in disturbing detail. He described where Sarah's body had been, the position she was in, even the specific wounds. At the time, the family assumed he'd learned those details from police reports or news coverage. But looking back, the cousin admitted it felt like Derek was speaking from direct knowledge, not secondhand information. Another relative remembered Derek asking a strange question a few weeks after the murders. He'd asked, almost hypothetically, whether someone could kill another person and then block it out completely. Forget they'd done it. The relative had laughed nervously, thinking it was just a weird thought experiment. But the question had stuck with him all these years. Then, there was the matter of Sarah's belongings. Multiple family members mentioned that Derek had taken control of clearing out Sarah and Tom's house. He'd done it quickly, almost frantically, packing up their things, throwing away papers, even burning some items in the backyard. When asked why he was in such a hurry, he'd said he wanted to spare the family the pain of going through it all. But his urgency had felled off, like he was trying to erase something. One detail stood out more than the others. Derek had tried to sell Sarah and Tom's bed, the bed where Sarah had been killed. He'd mentioned it casually to a relative, asking if they knew anyone who might want it. The relative had been horrified and refused. But the fact that Derek had even suggested it sent chills through everyone who heard about it later. Torres and Brennan also uncovered financial tensions. Sarah and Tom had been working hard to pay off their house, and there had been discussions about life insurance policies, shared family property, and inheritance matters. Derek had argued with Sarah about money in the months before her death. Nothing explosive, but enough that people remembered it. Then came the most damning revelation. Multiple family members, when interviewed separately, admitted that Derek had told them at different times that he and Sarah had been sexually involved when they were younger. He'd never been explicit, but he'd made comments that crossed every line. Each person had kept the information to themselves, uncomfortable and unsure what to do with it. But now, hearing that others had been told the same thing, the weight of it became undeniable. By the time Torres and Brennan compiled all the statements, they had a clear picture. Derek Cole wasn't just a grieving brother. He was someone with a deeply inappropriate relationship with his sister, a history of control and intimidation and behavior after her death that suggested guilt, not grief. They had enough to bring him in for questioning, and this time, they weren't going to let him walk away so easily. Torres and Brennan scheduled separate interviews with both Derek and Monica. They wanted to see how their stories held up under renewed scrutiny and whether the cracks that had appeared would widen under pressure. Monica came in first. She arrived looking nervous, but there was also a sense of relief on her face, like she'd been carrying a burden for too long and was finally ready to set it down. The detectives led her into a small interview room, offered her water, and sat down across from her. Brennan spoke first, her tone calm but direct. "Monica, we appreciate you coming in. We know this isn't easy, but we need you to walk us through what really happened in December 1987. Monica nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a breath and started talking. She explained how Derek had been agitated in the days leading up to the murders. He'd been angry about something involving Sarah, though he wouldn't tell Monica exactly what. She remembered him pacing the apartment, muttering under his breath, slamming doors. On the night of December 8th, Derek had left their apartment late, around midnight. He told Monica he had something to take care of and that she shouldn't ask questions. She'd been too afraid to push back. He didn't return until late the following afternoon, nearly 16 hours later. When he came back, he was different, quiet, withdrawn. He kept washing his hands, even though they looked clean. A few days later, after the bodies were discovered, Derek sat Monica down and told her exactly what to say if the police came asking questions. He made her rehearse the alibi until she could recite it without hesitation. He said if she didn't stick to the story, she'd regret it. The threat was implicit, but clear. "I was 19, Monica said, her voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. I was scared of him. So elite. I've regretted it every day since." When Torres asked if she'd take another polygraph to confirm her account, she agreed immediately. The test was scheduled, and once again, the results indicated she was telling the truth. A few days later, Derek was brought in. He walked into the station with the same confidence he'd carried for years, his posture rigid, his expression guarded. He clearly didn't expect this interview to be any different from the one he'd given in 1987. Torres and Brennan let him sit for a few minutes before entering the room, a small psychological tactic to make him feel the weight of the situation. When they finally sat down across from him, Brennan opened with a simple statement. "We've been reviewing your sister's case. Some new information has come to light." Derek's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of information?" Torres leaned forward. "Monica gave us a new statement. She says the alibi you gave in 1987 wasn't true." Derek's face flushed. "She's lying, is she?" Brennan asked. "Because she passed a polygraph. Twice." Derek shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests. "I don't know why she'd say that. Maybe she's trying to get back at me for something. We didn't end on good terms." Torres pressed. "Where were you on the night of December 8th, 1987? "I already told you. I was with Monica. At home." "That's not what she says." Derek's voice rose slightly. "Then she's lying." The detectives didn't back down. They pushed harder, presenting him with the statements from family members, the comments he'd made about Sarah, the unsettling behavior after her death. With each new detail, Derek grew more agitated. His calm exterior began to crack. He denied everything, his voice growing louder, more defensive. But the detectives had what they needed. His alibi was gone. The witness who'd protected him for over 20 years had recanted, and the disturbing pattern of his behavior was now documented, corroborated by multiple sources. Before they let him leave, Torres made one thing clear. "We're not done here, Derek. This case is active again, and we will find the truth." Derek left the station visibly shaken, but he didn't know the worst part yet. The foundation he'd built his freedom on had just collapsed beneath him, and the detectives weren't going to stop. After the tense interview with Derek, Torres and Brennan knew they needed something more concrete. Monica's recanted alibi was significant, but they needed corroboration. They needed someone willing to come forward with information that could definitively place Derek at the scene or confirm his guilt. That's when Monica reached out to them again. She called the station on a Thursday afternoon, her voice shaking. "I need to talk to you. In person. There's more I didn't tell you." Torres and Brennan met her at the station within the hour. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. When they sat down across from her, she didn't waste time. "He told me what he did," she said quietly. "Not right away, but eventually he couldn't keep it inside anymore." Brennan leaned forward. "What did he tell you?" Monica took a shaky breath. A few weeks after the murders, Derek was having nightmares. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, shaking. One night, he started talking. He said he'd gone to Sarah and Tom's house that night because he was angry. He didn't plan it, he said, but once he got there, he couldn't stop himself. She paused, wiping her eyes. He said he knocked on the door. Tom answered, half asleep. Derek told him he was having car trouble and needed help. Tom stepped outside, and that's when Derek pulled out a gun. He shot Tom right there, through the truck window, while Tom was sitting in the driver's seat. Torres wrote quickly, his face grim. "And Sarah?" Monica's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he went inside. She was asleep. He stood in the doorway for a minute, just watching her. Then he shot her, multiple times. He said she didn't even wake up before the first shot. Brennan's expression remained controlled, but her fists clenched under the table. Did he say why? He said she was going to ruin everything, that she was going to tell people things she shouldn't. He didn't explain what, but I think it had to do with what happened between them when they were younger. I think she was going to expose him. Monica continued, her words spilling out now. "After he told me, he made me go back to the house with him. He wanted me to see what he'd done. He took me inside, showed me where Sarah had been lying, where Tom was in the truck. It was like he wanted me to be part of it, like he needed me to be complicit so I'd never tell." She looked directly at the detectives, tears streaming down her face. "I should have come forward back then. I know that. But I was terrified. He told me if I ever said anything, I'd end up like them. And I believed him." Torres asked, "Do you remember anything else? Any details about the gun, the clothes he was wearing, anything physical?" Monica nodded. "He had a handgun. I'd seen it before. He kept it in a lockbox in the apartment. After the murders, it was gone. He said he got rid of it, threw it in a river somewhere. And his clothes, he burned them in a barrel behind our building. I watched him do it." The detectives spent the next 2 hours going over every detail Monica could remember. They recorded her statement, documented every piece of information, and assured her that she was doing the right thing, even if it was 23 years late. By the time Monica left the station, Torres and Brennan had what they needed. A full confession, secondhand but credible, backed by a witness who had passed 2 polygraph tests and whose account aligned with the physical evidence. They immediately began coordinating with the prosecutor's office. Within days, an arrest warrant was issued for Derek Cole. Officers arrived at his house early one morning, approaching carefully. Derek didn't resist physically, but his face twisted with rage the moment they read him his rights. He shouted that they were making a mistake, that Monica was lying, that his family would never believe them. But as he was led to the patrol car in handcuffs, his bravado began to falter. He knew what they had. He knew the walls were closing in. Over the next several days, Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic. He called the detectives repeatedly from jail, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening. He insisted Monica was lying, that his family was being manipulated, that the detectives were corrupt. Each message was logged, each one adding to the growing portrait of a man unraveling under pressure. Meanwhile, the investigation moved forward. Detectives interviewed more witnesses, gathered additional statements from family members, and built a timeline that left no room for doubt. By the time the case file was handed to the prosecutor, it was clear Derek Cole had murdered his sister and brother-in-law in cold blood, and he'd gotten away with it for more than 2 decades. The trial began months later, and it quickly became the most talked-about case Lansing County had seen in years. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with family members, reporters, and curious residents who had followed the case since 1987. The prosecution opened with a clear, methodical presentation of the evidence, walking the jury through the events of December 1987, the failed investigation, and the breakthrough that had finally brought justice within reach. Monica took the stand early in the trial. She sat in the witness box, visibly nervous, her hands gripping the edges of the chair. The prosecutor asked her to recount what Derek had told her, and she did, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. She described the night he left, the way he looked when he returned, and the horrifying confession he'd made weeks later. She described being forced to go back to the house, being threatened into silence, living with the fear for over 20 years. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting she was lying to get revenge on an ex-boyfriend, that her memory was unreliable after so many years. But Monica didn't waver. She answered every question clearly, and when asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, she looked directly at the jury and said, "Because I was terrified, and I'm still terrified, but I can't live with this secret anymore." Other witnesses followed. Family members testified about Derek's disturbing comments, his obsession with Sarah, his strange behavior after her death. Angela, his ex-girlfriend, described the inappropriate things he'd said about his sister. A cousin recounted how Derek had described the crime scene with unsettling accuracy. Each piece of testimony added another layer to the case. An inmate who'd been housed near Derek in jail also testified. He said Derek had talked openly about the murders, bragging about how he'd taken care of a problem and gotten away with it for decades. The defense objected repeatedly, but the testimony was allowed, and the jury listened intently. Throughout the trial, Derek reacted badly. He interrupted witnesses, shouted objections, and glared at Monica with barely concealed rage. The judge warned him multiple times to control himself, and court officers had to step in more than once when his behavior escalated. His outbursts didn't help his case. If anything, they reinforced the prosecution's portrait of a violent, unstable man capable of murder. The defense tried to present alternative theories. They suggested other suspects, pointed to the initial investigation's failures, and argued that Monica's testimony was unreliable. But none of their arguments gained traction. The physical evidence, the timeline, and the corroborated witness statements all pointed in one direction. After 2 weeks of testimony, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury and summarized the case clearly. Derek Cole had killed his sister and brother-in-law in a calculated act of violence, then spent 23 years hiding behind a false alibi. The evidence was overwhelming, and the time for justice had finally come. The defense argued that the case was built on the testimony of a single unreliable witness, that the police had failed to consider other possibilities, and that reasonable doubt existed. But their argument felt thin, unsupported by the weight of the evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood, and the verdict was read: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. A collective exhale moved through the room. Lisa, Sarah's sister, buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Tom's mother closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her face. Derek sat motionless at the defense table, staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. When that day arrived, the courtroom was once again filled. The judge reviewed the case, the evidence, and the jury's verdict before delivering the sentence. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Tom's brother spoke during the sentencing, his voice breaking as he described the decades of pain, the unanswered questions, and the relief of finally knowing the truth. He looked directly at Derek and said, "You took them from us, but you didn't win. We never stopped fighting for them, and now, finally, they have justice." Derek tried to interrupt, his voice rising in anger, but the judge silenced him. The sentence was finalized, and officers led Derek out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He continued shouting as he was escorted away, his voice fading as the doors closed behind him. In the months that followed, Derek filed multiple appeals, each one claiming procedural errors, unreliable testimony, and wrongful conviction. Each appeal was reviewed and denied. The verdict stood. Among all his relatives, only his mother refused to accept his guilt. She maintained his innocence, insisting the system had failed him, that he'd been framed. But the rest of the family, including Sarah's siblings, accepted the verdict. For them, it was the end of a long, painful chapter. Outside the courthouse that day, Lisa stood with her family, the cold air biting at their faces. For the first time in 23 years, there was an answer. Not the one they'd wanted, but the truth nonetheless. And with that truth, they could finally begin to move forward. When the final gavel came down and Derek Cole was led out of the courtroom for the last time, something shifted in Lansing County. The case that had haunted the community for over 2 decades finally had resolution. News of the conviction spread quickly, and for those who remembered the fear and uncertainty of 1987, the verdict brought a complicated sense of relief. For Sarah and Tom's families, life didn't return to normal. Normal had been taken from them the night Derek walked into their home with a gun. But the unbearable weight of not knowing, the endless questions that had haunted every holiday and anniversary, finally lifted. They could speak about Sarah and Tom without the conversation ending in frustrated silence. They could visit the cemetery without feeling like they'd failed them. Lisa returned to Sarah's grave more often in the months after the trial. She'd sit on the cold ground, talking to her sister, telling her that justice had finally come. She brought flowers, small tokens, and sometimes just her presence. The pain of losing Sarah would never go away, but now it wasn't compounded by the agony of unanswered questions. Tom's family found their own form of peace. His mother said in a quiet interview months later that she'd spent 23 years wondering if the person who killed her son was still out there, still living freely. Now she knew. The man was behind bars, where he would remain for the rest of his life. That knowledge didn't bring Tom back, but it allowed her to breathe a little easier. The cold case unit, led by Torres and Brennan, received recognition for their work. Their persistence, their refusal to accept the easy answers, had broken open a case that many had considered unsolvable. Other departments reached out, asking for advice on their own cold cases. The Mitchell case became an example of what fresh eyes and relentless dedication could accomplish, even decades after a crime. The community itself began to heal. The fear that had lingered for so long, the whispered theories, the suspicion that had settled over neighborhoods, all of it finally dissipated. People could talk about the case without it feeling like an open wound. The story became part of local history, tragic but resolved. As the legal appeals were exhausted and Derek's final attempts to overturn the conviction failed, the case truly closed. The file that had sat gathering dust for over 20 years was finally marked solved and placed in the archives. Detectives could point to it as proof that no case was ever truly cold, as long as someone was willing to keep looking. Sarah and Tom's story, once defined by violence and mystery, was now defined by something else: persistence. The persistence of a family that never stopped asking questions. The persistence of detectives who refused to let the case die. And the persistence of one woman, Monica, who finally found the courage to speak the truth she'd been forced to bury for so long. In the end, the truth had found its way forward. And though it took 23 years, justice arrived. This case is a stark reminder of how fear, manipulation, and silence can bury the truth for decades. One lie, repeated under threat, kept the killer free for over 20 years. It shows how abuse can hide in plain sight, how danger can exist within families, and how a single act of courage can finally break the silence that once seemed unbreakable. The truth only emerged when someone felt safe enough to speak, and that simple shift changed everything. It also demonstrates the power of persistence in cold case investigations. When dedicated detectives returned to a forgotten file with fresh eyes, patience, and determination, the pieces finally fell into place. Their work, combined with testimony that had been suppressed for decades, brought justice to Sarah and Tom Mitchell when everyone else had given up hope. Even after 23 years, the truth found its path forward. And that should give hope to every family still waiting for answers in their own unsolved cases. Justice may be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about cold cases being solved decades later? Do you believe every case deserves a second look, no matter how much time has passed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Turn on notifications so you're always the first to know when we post. These stories matter, and your support helps us keep telling them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.